All right, so I wanted to go back because I feel like I kind of stumbled over the last part of the last video, and so so we've talking about cellular respiration, okay? The major point of cellular respiration is to produce energy for the cell, and there are three major parts. You have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Now, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, you may see different names for it. You may see the citric acid cycle. You may see electron transport phosphorylation, but it's the same thing. Now, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. And then the other two parts happen inside the mitochondria, and that's why the mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell. Majority of the ATP for the cell is produced in the mitochondria because this is where these two processes occur. Now, what you're getting from glycolysis, you're getting that initial breakdown of a 6-carbon glucose molecule into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. Now, each of those pyruvate molecules are going to go into the next step. And the next step happens inside the mitochondria, where they are both transformed into acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon molecule. All right, and then each 2-carbon acetyl-CoA molecule will then enter the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. All right, and when you get 2 runs of the Krebs cycle, because each of those acetyl-CoA molecules will go into the Krebs cycle, you get these products here. You get 6 molecules of carbon dioxide produced, 2 ATP, 2 NADH, and 8 NADH and 2 FADH2. Now remember, these guys, NADH and FADH2, their main role is to carry electrons to the electron transport chain. All right, and then you have a little bit of ATP is made. All right, and then here you have the carbon dioxide being produced. Now, where do you think that carbon dioxide goes? This is the carbon dioxide that you breathe out. Okay, all right. So the carbon dioxide that you exhale is because of it being produced in cellular respiration. All right, again, so you have the next step, you first have those 2 3-carbon molecule pyruvate molecules being transformed into 2-carbon acetyl-CoA molecules. They then enter the citric acid cycle. All right, and then these together, we're going to get those 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, okay, 2 ATP made, all right, 2 FeDH2, and then 8 NADH molecules. All right, so this is kind of that major counting that we were, doing with glycolysis. We'll do here, and then we'll do with electron transport chain. All right, so here's a Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle. Now we said with glycolysis, that was a linear metabolic pathway. Well, here is a great example of a cyclical metabolic pathway, because you have the first step being acetyl-CoA, a 2-carbon molecule, bind with oxaloacetate or oxaloacetic acid, a 4-carbon molecule, to make a 6-carbon molecule of citric acid. That's why it's called a citric acid cycle. Why is it called Krebs cycle? Because a guy named Krebs discovered it. Okay? But as you can see, what is the last step of the Krebs cycle? It is to produce this 4-carbon oxaloacetate molecule again so that it can run again, okay? Making it a cyclical metabolic pathway. All right, so it's just, important to know this first step. That's why, it's considered a cyclical metabolic pathway. And then basically, the big takeaway points are you get your, the NADH, FADH2 being produced, a little bit of ATP, okay, some carbon dioxide being produced as a byproduct. But the major point of the Krebs cycle is you get a lot of electron carriers being produced. Now, how are they produced? They are produced through these redox reactions, remember? All right, so NAD and FAD, all right, they accept electrons. They are reduced, okay? They accept electrons in the form of these hydrogen ions, all right, and they become reduced. And then they take those electrons to the next step. All right, so summary Krebs cycle. The first step of the Krebs cycle, you have those acetyl-CoA molecules bind to, each one binds to an oxaloacetate each time it runs through to form a 6-carbon citrate molecule. That's why it's called, or citrate, citric acid. That's why I call it the citric acid cycle. All right, and so it ends, the final step of the Krebs cycle ends with the formation of a new oxaloacetate molecule, allowing it to run again. All right, now through each run, you have 4 NAD are reduced to produce 4 NADH molecules. 1 FAD are reduced to FADH2 molecule. These are your electron carriers. You have an ATP molecule being produced. All right. Now these numbers look different than what we went over before because you got to multiply them times 2. Because for every breakdown of a glucose molecule, all right, you get 2 pyruvate molecules, which you get transformed into 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. All right, so you got, it can run twice for every breakdown of a 1 6-carbon glucose molecule. Now, this third stage is where you have the majority of your ATP being produced. So the third stage of aerobic respiration occurs at the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it's the big energy payoff. Most of the ATP is produced at this step. All right, so what happens? You have those electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, produced during the first 2 stages. They deliver electrons and those hydrogen ions to the electron transfer chains. Okay, so here you get the NADH that's produced during glycolysis and Krebs cycle. You get FADH2. All right, then you have oxygen. And we'll talk about the role of oxygen in a second. All right, but then you have electron transport chain or electron transfer phosphorylation. Different names, same thing. All right. And so at the end of it, you get most of your ATP being produced. Okay, based on this 32 molecules of ATP being produced. So what happens? Right. So the when those FADH2 molecules and NADH molecules come to the beginning of the electron transfer chains, they give they give the electrons up, and then the electrons move through a series of electron transfer reactions, those redox reactions. Okay, and with each reaction, they give up a little bit of energy. Remember that staircase we talked about? That's what, you have a staircase here, those electron transfer reactions. That, those electrons are going down each staircase. And with each step, okay, each reaction step, all right, that they're being donated and accepted by different molecules, you have energy being given off. What's the point of that energy? Well, this is where the hydrogen ions come in. All right, those hydrogen ions that are given up by NADH and FADH2 molecules, all right, that energy from the electron transport chains, that energy is used to shuttle hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient across the inner membrane. Okay? All right, now it says it's actively transported. Remember what active transport needs? It needs the input of energy. All right? So hydrogen ions are actively transported with the input of energy from those electron transfer reactions, all right, to be moved against their concentration gradient across the inner membrane, in the inner membrane space between the inner and outer membrane of the mitochondria. All right, and so what happens is you have a large hydrogen ion gradient. All right, and the only way that those hydrogen ions can move down their concentration gradient where they want to go is through a protein in the inner membrane called ATP synthase. Now, what kind of molecule do you think ATP synthase is? All right, what are the three letters that synthase ends in? ASE. So that means ATP synthase is an enzyme. All right, and so as the hydrogen ions move down their concentration gradient through ATP synthase, they're giving off energy, and then ATP synthase uses that energy to produce ATP. Okay, now I hadn't talked about oxygen yet. All right, now we talked about those electron transfer reactions. In that staircase, those electrons are going. All right, and with each reaction, with each step, they're being transferred, donated, and accepted. And with each of those reactions, they give off energy. Well, there's something at the bottom of that staircase that's pulling those electrons down that staircase. And what is that? That's oxygen. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor. That is the main reason that you need oxygen, to breathe in oxygen. So that oxygen can be transported to your cells, and then those oxygen molecules can act as a final electron acceptor in this process. Okay? All right, and when those oxygen, some of that oxygen, that's when they accept the final electrons, they'll also bond with some of those hydrogen ions that are coming down their concentration gradient, and that's how you get water formed as a byproduct. But again, the majority of the ATP that's produced during cellular respiration occurs during this process, this third and final process. So here's a good figure, okay? So you have your electron carriers, okay, donating their electrons. And those electrons are going down the staircase, the electron transfer reaction staircase. And every time they are accepted by another molecule, they're giving off energy. Okay, where does that energy go? That energy is used to shuttle hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. Okay, so they're going where they are a smaller concentration to an area of larger concentration. That's why energy is needed from these electrons. But what's pulling down those electrons down the staircase? Oxygen, right there, your final electron acceptor. Okay, well, how are those hydrogen ions going to be able to move down their concentration gradient from here in the inner membrane space where it's higher back into the matrix? The only way they can go is through the ATP synthase molecule here. All right, and as they go through, they give off energy, and this enzyme uses that energy to produce ATP. All right, so that's basically the steps of the electron transport chain. Now remember, if you think about, let's go back to here. What's the purpose of these cristae? You see these inner membrane, okay, foldings that we call cristae. What's the purpose of the foldings of the inner membrane? Now remember, all right, the electron transport chain is happening across the inner membrane, okay? And where's the majority of the ATP being produced? In the electron transport chain, all right? Now, if you have more foldings, you have the ability to have more electron transport chains happening at the same time. And if you have more electron transport chains happening at the same time along these foldings of the inner membrane, what will the mitochondria be able to produce more of? There you go, energy. All right, so the cristae increases the surface area of the inner membrane, so more electron transport chains can happen than if they weren't there. So curves across the inner membrane, the electron transport chain does. Here you have those electron carriers deliver their electrons to the chain. All right, the energy from the redox reactions in the staircase is used to shuttle hydrogen molecules against their concentration gradient. Oxygen is at the bottom of the staircase, pulling those electrons down the staircase, and it serves as a final electron acceptor. The only way that hydrogen can go down their concentration gradient is through the enzyme ATP synthase, which uses the energy from the hydrogens going down their concentration gradient to make ATP. All right, and every time you have a run of the electron transport chain, around 16 ATP are made. But remember, for the breakdown of one glucose molecule, okay, you got to multiply this number by 2, and you get the 32 that we saw earlier. So for each 6-carbon glucose molecule that is broken down to cellular respiration, because again, that's what we're doing. We're breaking down a larger molecule, right, to produce energy. All right, so for every 6-carbon glucose molecule that is broken down, you get 2 ATP made in glycolysis. You get 1 made in the Krebs cycle, multiply that times 2. You get 16 made in the electron transport chain, multiply that times 2. Okay, because each of the pyruvate molecules that are produced here, they kind of go on and fuel 2 runnings of the Krebs cycle and 2 runnings of the electron transport chain. So in the end, you have, for every 1 6-carbon glucose molecule, approximately 36 ATP molecules are produced. Right, so this figure is just showing you, summarizing the glycolysis, acetyl-CoA formation, and citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Shows you where it happens in the cell, and then sort of the major players in each step. All right, so it's a good summary figure. And so if you can, when you're thinking about cellular respiration, if you can kind of walk through this figure in your head, then you have a good feel for it. All right, now that's aerobic respiration, right? So aerobic respiration occurs in the presence of oxygen. All right, and so if you don't have oxygen, you can't have the Krebs cycle, and you can't have the electron transport chain. Okay. All right. It doesn't mean you can't have production of ATP. You just won't have nearly as much, because in the absence of oxygen, it's anaerobic respiration or fermentation. So fermentation is a sugar breakdown pathway that does not require oxygen to make ATP. All right, and so you can still have glycolysis. All right, but you don't have the other 2, major processes of the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. You just have glycolysis in the cytoplasm. All right. So unlike aerobic respiration, fermentation occurs entirely in the cytoplasm and does not include electron transfer chains. The net yield is 2 ATP, which provides enough energy, okay, for many single cell species, and it provides enough energy to kind of run through it again, okay? All right. So now you have 2 types of anaerobic respiration. You have alcoholic fermentation and you have lactate fermentation. And again, 2 net ATP are made. Okay, NAD is oxidized, so it is regenerated so that glycolysis can run again. So let's kind of talk, kind of contrast alcohol and lactate fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation is anaerobic sugar breakdown pathway that produces ATP, carbon dioxide, and ethanol. All right, so in alcoholic fermentation, a 3-carbon pyruvate is split into carbon dioxide and a 2-carbon acetaldehyde. All right, and then the electrons of hydrogen are transferred from NADH to acetaldehyde. All right, and so you have the oxidation of NADH to form NAD again, so it can run through fermentation again, and then you have ethanol, and that's the major byproduct of alcoholic fermentation is ethanol. All right, so again, here you go. Okay, a little bit of ATP is made, not nearly as much as in aerobic respiration, and then basically you have NADH being oxidized to produce NAD again, so you can be able to run glycolysis. So the major byproduct of alcohol fermentation is this ethanol. Now contrast that with lactate fermentation. Okay, instead of producing ethanol, it produces ATP and lactate. Okay, and so the electrons and hydrogen ions carried by NADH are transferred directly to pyruvate, and then that pyruvate is converted to lactate. But in this process, the NADH is oxidized again so that glycolysis can happen again. Now, in your body, you have fermentation happen. Okay, you have lactate fermentation happen. When you're working out hard and your muscles start to burn, all right, that is a byproduct of your cells, of your muscle cells, producing lactic acid or lactate. That produces that burning sensation because those particular cells, have run out of oxygen, so they can't do aerobic respiration anymore, and so now they're trying to produce energy through lactate fermentation. So animal muscle cells carry out both aerobic respiration and or lactate fermentation. So intense exercise depletes oxygen faster than it can be replenished. And so in those cases, ATP is produced by lactate fermentation. All right. And then the lactate can build up in the cells and cause soreness. All right. So again, just showing you, and here the big product is lactate or lactic acid instead of ethanol. And this, when that builds up in your cells, that will produce the burning sensation in your muscle cells. But when you finish, all right, or when you relax, that oxygen can be replenished in those muscle cells. That lactate breaks down, and then those cells will then go back to aerobic respiration. All right, so we'll disregard these last few slides. Here's your need to know slide, okay? So why are redox reactions important in cellular respiration as well as electron transfer chains? All right, and what occurs during them, generally speaking. All right, what are the major differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? What are the 4 major steps of aerobic respiration? And be able to summarize what occurs in those steps. Not necessarily those specific chemical reactions, but we went over the main points in those.
A chemical reaction is a process that leads.
Went over in those steps. How much ATP is produced at each step, and
80 pence is $1.02.
And then what's the importance of ATP and oxygen? Okay, ATP is a major energy molecule, and then oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor. And then finally, just be able to compare and contrast alcohol and lactic acid fermentation. All right, this is a tough chapter. Okay, so you're going to have to spend some time, familiarizing yourself with the information, look over it, and more than once, several times. And obviously, if you have any questions, let me know.